Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Panem et circenses. Translated to bread and circuses is a metonymic phrase referring to superficial appeasement. In a political context, it actually means to generate public approval, not by excellence in public service or public policy, why bother, but by diversion and distraction, or by satisfying the most immediate or base requirements of a populace by offering food, bread, or entertainment circuses. Hello, welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hockton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster. So, Biden was declared 46th President of the United States of America in October 2020. Trump called it all a lie and gave a loser's speech on the 6th of January 2021, which then resulted in a mob descending on the Capitol. Within 36 hours of the riot, 5 people had died. 174 police officers were injured, and 4 officers who responded to the attack died by suicide within 7 months. All incredibly tragic, all incredibly true. Trump then fought tooth and nail to cling to power. So is this unheard of? And is Trump just playing an ancient game very well? Who does Trump think he is? Is he a modern-day Julius Caesar or just a slightly updated, photoshopped Richard Nixon? Ancient or modern? The joke, of course, is that Trump was brought the news that Biden had been elected while he was on the golf course. So there were lots of comments about dictators being cornered in bunkers. You know, the Hitler parallel had been aired many, many times. But to be honest, it's not one that I buy into, and I don't have much time for it. 3 things that Trump and Hitler did have in common is that they're both very funny about their food. So Hitler was, of course, a vegetarian, and Trump only eats McDonald's burgers. And they're both very lazy. Hitler didn't get up until midday and didn't do any work, and Trump's work ethic is very similar. He watches a lot of TV late into the night and from his bed in the morning. And both Hitler and Trump were teetotalers. However, I do think I'm really pushing the boundaries of historical inquiry here. And of course, one of the comparisons of Trump to Richard Nixon is that he was also winched out of the White House kind of kicking and screaming. Basically, it's the only analogy that I can think of somebody leaving the White House in this sort of, I guess, era of shambolic indignity that we have with Trump. Nixon, of course, did not lose an election. He was an election winner, not loser, and actually a massive winner. So Nixon essentially had to resign, but he did fight as furiously as Trump to stay in the White House. Nixon's story, I think, is quite an extraordinary story and much more complicated than the Trump story, because Nixon was an incredibly popular president, and he actually won the 1972 presidential election in a stonking landslide. So there's a big contrast there with Trump. Nixon actually won every single state except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. So a kind of an utter wipeout of the Democrats. But Nixon's gnawing insecurity was such that he got his team effectively to bug the Democrats, and then he colluded, and then he covered it up, and then he covered up some more. So it was effectively just cover up after cover up after cover up. So you had this unfolding scandal for the next sort of, I think it was about 18 months or so. And when it turned out that Nixon had been taping himself and, you know, his dirty secrets were aired before the American public, he really had to go. But of course, as politicians always do, he fought and he sort of tried everything he could to stay in power. He tried to spin things. And eventually, in August 1974, the Republican senators told him, you know, time's up and you have to go. But where I think the parallel actually works is that, you know, Nixon left in the most undignified way possible. So he gave a fairly standard resignation speech to the nation. You know, it was televised. You can Google it. You can see it. But when it came to the day of his departure, So the morning of his actual departure from the White House, he must have stayed up all night sort of sweating and staring into the shadows. And you see it on TV, he's tired, he's knackered, he's overwrought, and he's a bit of a mess. And then he gives this extraordinary farewell speech to his staff, which is also televised. And any listeners who have seen the amazing Anthony Hopkins film Nixon will probably remember this. And then he just completely disintegrates on camera. He starts talking about his dad, who was this little guy and a common guy. He says his mother was a saint. He starts crying when he talks about his mother. And it's just this terrible, this awful disintegration in front of the nation. And it flies completely in the face of everything Americans expect from their president, which is a level of dignity and civility and sort of sobriety and all of the rest of it. And it's sort of gone down as the acme of what not to do, how, not to leave the White House. And that's interesting because, part of one of the things, of course, that Trump's behavior raises is the question of why do people find it so shocking? And why did people find Nixon's behavior so shocking? And it suggests that there is a kind of very strong, often unwritten code about how Americans expect their politicians and particularly their leaders to behave. And of course, it so often goes against reality because I guess to reach the top of American politics, you have to play hard and you have to play dirty. There's no other way about it. But there is a kind of always, the sense that there are moral standards that you must live up to. And what Trump did, as Nixon did, if you break that, then people are genuinely shocked. Politicians do fight hard, but actually when you look back at American politics, the striking thing is how often they feel the need to conform to these hidden codes. So Al Gore, when he lost the presidency to George W. Bush in 2000, in very dubious circumstances, I have to say, he behaved in a very, Roman way. And this is really interesting, which is why I brought this analogy to the podcast. People often ask, how often do you think of the Romans? And it's an interesting question. Ask yourself that. How often do you think of the Romans? Me, I think of them every day because they changed the world that we know it today, some 2,000 years later. Because, of course, it's the question of the code, just going back to Al Gore, the code of honor. It goes back ultimately to General Washington. Washington was this incredible general. He was a victorious general who deposed a king and who has labored to establish this incredible republic. And so the big question is he going to lay down his sword? Is he going to return to his farm? And that's actually exactly what happens. And what I think is incredibly interesting is that the American founding fathers, they're absolutely steeped in this culture of ancient Roman history. And they have the model of the Roman Republic at hand, because the Roman Republic is established after a king is expelled. And it works because it establishes this code, the customs held to by the ancestors, that everyone is expected to hold to. And that's what the founding fathers are looking to. And that is the exact model that Washington is drawing on. So the Washington story is a good one. He basically gives up his command in 1783. The Continental Army has won. Well, actually, the French have actually won the war for them, but they've won. Britain has been beaten and has basically given up. America has its independence, and actually then there is a 6-year break before Washington actually becomes president. So he doesn't actually become president until 1789. And basically, they have to drag him kicking and screaming into the job. He actually doesn't want to do it. They turn to him because he's this incredible unifying figure, because he's a patriotic figure and, all the rest of it. But he really doesn't fancy it. He just doesn't want the job. And then after his first term, again, he doesn't really want to carry on. And they basically compel him to. The other founding fathers say, no, you must stay on. You must do it. And then he leaves after his second term and establishes this tradition that only one president, FDR, in the Second World War has ever broken, that a president will only serve 2 terms. That sort of ethos, the reluctant leader who has to be sort of coerced into the job. He was the president of a society of a group called the Society of the Cincinnati. And there you have it. There's your Roman hero. Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus is absolutely the archetype for this, who is a legendary figure from the early years of the Roman Republic. And the reason that he serves as such an iconic figure, both for the Romans and then for the Americans, is that he's a great war leader who is also a farmer, and he's summoned from his plow to save the people, to lead his country. And then, having saved his country, he then returns to the plow. And this is such a kind of a perfect image for Washington. There's a sensational statue, I think it's actually in the Smithsonian. I'm pretty sure it's in the Smithsonian, by Horatio Greenborough, which obviously, this is a podcast and I can't unfortunately show you this, but Google it, look it up. And it's so brilliant because what it actually shows is Washington with his wig in a toga holding a sword. And it perfectly illustrates this kind of strange 18th century Roman fusion that the American early republic kind of absolutely plays with. So those early Americans, they basically thought they were Romans, didn't they? They must have, but a particular kind of Roman, right? Because obviously there's lots of, they do have this sort of idealized image of Rome, don't you think? And I think what they're thinking is that the Romans were actually probably exactly like us. I think they are haunted by the fact that, of course, the early days of the Republic, when everyone is virtuous and kind of yeoman farmers and at their plow, that the Roman Republic expands, it becomes incredibly wealthy. It becomes a superpower. It establishes its rule across the whole of the Mediterranean. And this then provides opportunities for ambitious Roman politicians who put the entire Republic in its shadow. And in due course, that results in the establishment of an autocracy. And so every founding father is nervously aware of this. And so when Benjamin Franklin, when he comes in, he actually says, is this going to be a republic? Yes, if we can keep hold of it. And that anxiety is always, I guess, it's because, Nixon is very keen on the idea of America as an imperial republic. And so that's part of the shadow, I would guess, of what's going on with, Watergate and people's anxiety about him. And people were talking about the imperial presidency. I remember it very clearly at the time. They actually spoke about it. Basically, until the 20th century, America was kind of happening. But as far as the rest of the world was concerned, it was somewhere else. It was like, who cared about them? Let them get on with it. But then the 20th century, America does become an empire. People argue about this, but there's no doubt, really. It has colonies, it has overseas bases, it has influence, it's winning wars in foreign countries. It's absolutely becoming an empire. And people talk about the president as an American Caesar. They sort of used that terminology. So the presidencies of LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, who precedes Nixon, who's famous for Vietnam, and then Nixon, who ends the Vietnam War, that's kind of the high point of what people think of as the imperial presidency, of a president that can do whatever he wants, who can invade whoever he wants. And he is accumulating more and more power. And in Nixon's case, he's using people like, the FBI to survey his opponents, to bug his opponents. There's this sort of, fear, which now seems completely hysterical. But at the time, it was very, very real. And in the early 1970s, that, under Nixon America was turning into a sort of police state. And it was. And actually, that's not so different from what we've heard in the first years from, Donald Trump's critics, and also in the first 4 years of Biden. The only difference with Trump is that his critics believe that he represents the end of the Republican dream. And again, I think that small anxiety that has shadowed the American Republic pretty much from the beginning. It's always been there. Basically, if you model yourself on Rome, if you have a capital, if you have a Senate, if your capital city has loads of Roman columns and pillars that look like ancient Rome, then there are two things that again start to worry you. The first is that you're a republic, and that essentially the republic is going to collapse and a Caesar is going to emerge, an Augustus. And the second one is that that empire will also fall. I think Trump as a kind of Caesar has also been very popular. Andrew Jackson, he was a great general, a successful general, an 1812 war general. People actually start thinking that he's going to become a Caesar. It's talked about during his presidency. And I think that essentially the idea that if you model yourself on a republic, the idea that you're going to decline and fall is kind of hardwired into your mind, no matter what president or who you are as president. And isn't it odd that through the history that Americans keep electing generals, which is also a very Roman thing itself. So Andrew Jackson's a general, Ulysses Grant after the Civil War, and then even after World War II, they go for Eisenhower, the architect of D-Day. Although what's interesting with Biden, who like every other man of his generation, actually every other president of his generation, did not serve in a war. And actually the key factor about recent presidents is that they didn't serve in the military at all. It's kind of interesting. And the only one who did serve in the military, who famously failed to win the presidency, was John McCain. So John McCain is actually an extraordinary Roman figure, isn't he? I mean, he's like someone who basically decided to role play his entire life as a Roman war hero because he fights for his country, he gets captured and brutally tortured and refuses to give in. And again, that is absolutely redolent of figures from Roman history. There's this guy called Regulus who leads a campaign against the Carthaginians in the First Punic War. He gets captured, he gets sent back to Rome on the proviso that he will sue for terms and try and encourage the Senate to basically surrender to Carthage. Regulus gets back to Rome and then refuses to encourage the Senate to surrender. He says, no, carry on fighting. But then he feels honor bound to return to Carthage to tell them what's taken place, where he very promptly gets put in a barrel that has spikes driven through it. And then he gets rolled down a hill, and of course that kills him. Of course, John McCain survives his torture, but he kind of goes through torture for America in pretty much the same way that Regulus did. And in a way, one of the most kind of shocking things that Trump said, and kind of darkly funny in a way, was he said, I don't like losers. I don't like war heroes who get captured. I mean, that's completely shocking to the nation. And there was a particularly Roman moment with John McCain, I thought, and kind of interesting to shed a light on, by the way, that Roman politics perhaps hold a mirror up to, again, to contemporary American politics, which was John McCain's funeral. What happened at his funeral was that you had Democrats as well as Republicans going to it. And traditionally in Rome, funerals, a famous example is the funeral of Caesar, where great political stages where people could actually make statements. And the fact that Trump wasn't invited, there was a sense that the entire political establishment, the entire political order, people who held to the mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors, were gathering there to honor a great American hero. And what they told the world and what they told Trump was that he wasn't part of their club. And the reason I think that it's particularly interesting from the Roman context is that it reflects the way in which Roman politics were organized, which was essentially not about policy. It wasn't about the left or the right. It was more about style. It was about whether you upheld the traditional values of the elite or whether you kind of took the piss out of it. And that's very, very Roman and very, very American. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. So both the presidents that we've talked about, Trump and Nixon, they projected themselves as the champion of the common man, the ordinary American, the square-jawed guy, square dealing, the little guy who's trying to struggle, forward. Nixon talks about himself a lot as the little guy against the sneering snobs on Wall Street, the New York bankers, and the people of New England and all the rest of it. So actually, that sense of it being style rather than policy, I think it's something that they completely have in common, the two systems. And I think what's interesting about Trump is, and it so often doesn't come across just in the press reports, is that he's actually quite funny and quite a lot of what he says. So, the comments about McCain, as a classic example, are quite shocking, but they're also kind of designed to appeal to people who find the kind of traditional norms a bit stuffy, a bit boring. And that, again, is very Roman, because the kind of people who identify with the traditional ideals of the Roman Republic, I mean, they called themselves the Bonnie and the good people and the good guys, and set against them were the people who were called the populares, the people who appealed to the people. So you could actually translate that as populace. And that sense that to be a populist is somehow underhand is absolutely what the Bonnie, the good guys, are about in Roman politics. And I think that's been very much the trend in American politics as well. Hillary Clinton was the sort of Bonnie, par excellence, wasn't she? I mean, people kind of talked about her as very kind of school mistressy, that she was, very prim, very proper. Is mistressy a word? Well, anyway, you know what I mean. And the fact that she's Miss Goody Two Shoes. And Donald Trump was the kind of the raucous boy at the back of the class. Remember that talk that they gave, on TV where Hillary Clinton was talking and Trump was pacing back and forth behind her, kind of making faces. It's so traditional Trump, isn't it? It's so the boy at the back of the classroom, kind of raising his hand and answering questions when he's not supposed to. But also all the presidential candidates, I mean, even Nixon have kind of served their time in the traditional way. So they've gone through what the Romans called the cursus honorum, the greasy pole. They've served their time in politics, or they've served their time in the military, or whatever. They're academics. Trump didn't do any of that. Trump came from a background essentially in entertainment. And that's how he's governed. And it wasn't that he brought the methodology of entertainment to politics. He's actually turned politics into a form of entertainment. And that, again, was something that was kind of part of Roman life. There were political figures who used gladiatorial entertainment as a way of winning popular support. And they would mock the traditions that conventional political figures upheld. And I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about that because I think I've talked about this in other contexts about Roman emperors. Trump is an exceedingly rich man. He's actually somebody who, in many ways, people raise their eyebrows that he's the champion of the common man. But in Rome, the early emperors were steeped in wealth and privilege. And some had enormous excess in doing exactly what we've just talked about. Staging gladiatorial games, pandering to the people. I guess Caligula, Nero, those kind of emperors. All Roman politicians were incredibly rich. I mean, you had to be. And it's just so very like American politics. You just can't get anywhere without basically being very rich. So that wasn't really the issue. The issue was, it was essentially whether you were making a pitch to what the common guy thought, or were you standing sternly for traditional values. And of course, all comparisons, obviously, like this are incredibly stretched. But I think not entirely so with American Rome, because the American Republic founded itself on the Roman Republic. And I think you do get this kind of amazing dynamic that crosses and that you can compare to. So, Trump, he's very rich. But is he? Certainly not after the recent court ruling. And I mean, that's also one of the issues. One of the reasons why he was so desperate to cling to the presidency, and one of the reasons that he wants to be president, is actually kind of interesting. And there's a direct parallel there with Julius Caesar, because Caesar constantly flirted with bankruptcy. He speculated to accumulate. And in doing that, he brushed very, very heavily against the law. So the threat for Caesar was always that his enemies would prosecute him and bring him to trial. One of the reasons why Caesar ends up crossing the Rubicon, the Rubicon River, and involving Rome in a civil war, is that he gets cornered by his enemies. His enemies want to prosecute him. And get this, Caesar can't be prosecuted while he holds an official rank in the Republic. Does this sound familiar? So he's the governor of Gaul, so he can't be prosecuted. The moment he lays down that governorship and becomes a private citizen, then he can be prosecuted. So the issue on the Rubicon is that Caesar wants to go seamlessly from being governor of Gaul to being consul, so that he doesn't run the risk of prosecution. And basically, Trump is in a similar situation. And I'm sure that if, like Caesar, he had battle-hardened legions behind him, he absolutely wouldn't have surrendered the presidency. I mean, he wouldn't have hesitated to cross the Rubicon, just like Caesar did. But here's the thing. What current events show is that he may not have the Republican Party 100% behind him. With the crazy things that he's been doing, including the insurrection on January the 6th, I don't know whether he does. And of course, let's not forget that extraordinary press conference in the Garden Center. I think that's actually my favorite thing that ever happened during the Trump presidency. Giuliani tried to book the Four Seasons Hotel. So I don't know how it happened, but he tried to book the Four Seasons Hotel in Philadelphia to unveil his sort of ballot rigging claims. Remember all of this? They actually booked the wrong place. They booked a place called the Four Seasons Total Landscaping Garden Center in suburban Philadelphia, which is actually set between a sex shop and a crematorium. And Giuliani was there giving, the press conference at the very moment that the networks called the election for Biden. So in this extraordinary, humiliating way to, as people said, Trump started his career coming down a golden escalator and he ended it in the car park of a Philadelphia garden center. So that's very much not standing on the banks of the Rubicon with 5 legions, kind of blowing a trumpet, summoning you to glory. It's just not. But what about these characters like Nero and Caligula? These people who you can absolutely imagine doing the Roman equivalent of tweeting, how great they are and mocking your opponents, which is exactly what Trump does. And that's a very Roman thing, isn't it? So wholesale abuse of your opponents is actually very much a Roman thing. So Augustus, who was the first emperor of Rome, his genius is to keep these two traditions, the tradition of the boni and the tradition of the populare in balance. And he's clever enough to be able to play both of them. Tiberius is very much a traditionalist. He's very much a kind of John McCain figure. Caligula, who succeeds him, his genius is to discover that you can actually reap your power in the popularist tradition. Caligula, very much like Trump, he roars around town in a chariot drawn by literally hundreds of horses. And this is absolutely, the equivalent of a gold-stretched limo. And what I love about it is that it appeals to the people. I mean, Caligula understands that. And he understands that he can win an enormous amount of popularity by effectively taking the piss out of the traditional way of doing things, out of humiliating senators, out of mocking them, out of threatening them, and sometimes killing them. I mean, Trump has said that he could stand on a street corner in New York and kill someone and he wouldn't get arrested. And you know what? He's probably absolutely right. And of course, that's why Caligula talks about making his horse consul, right? Well, he says he's going to make it a consul. And of course, he actually doesn't. But what he's doing is mocking the institution. It's all a joke because he's essentially saying to senators, I have so much power that if I wanted to, I could make my horse consul. But then, of course, it's the senators who write the history. It's kind of the equivalent of the New York Times who write their history. And so Caligula actually gets condemned after he gets assassinated. But he doesn't get assassinated by his senators, but by his praetorians, because that's the key thing. You can't piss your base off. Your base are the ones who keep you there and support you, which is why Trump has this amazing base, because he plays to them all the time. And of course, with Caligula, it's very foolish to mock people who have swords. And, the white population in America have guns in droves. So you've got to keep the base happy by pissing off the elite, which is absolutely what he loves and what Caligula loved doing as well. However, the one mistake that Caligula makes is he mocks the head of his Praetorian Guard. And effectively, that's what dooms him. But after Caligula's death, his jokes get rewritten to demonstrate that he was insane. And I think there's a sense in which that's happened with Trump as well. The things that he said as jokes get rewritten to illustrate that he's a mad dictator, but he's not. And unfortunately for Trump, that's the faith of losers. And Trump lost the election. There's no question about that. So you get this incredible swing in Roman politics, which happens in American politics, where a traditionalist is succeeded by a popularist, who is then succeeded by a traditionalist. So after Caligula, you get Claudius, who's an antiquarian, very interested in Roman tradition. Like Biden, very interested in American tradition. And then you get Nero, who is absolutely a popularist to the degree that he plays the liar in public. He races chariots at the Olympics. He appears on stage, getting first place because everybody else, kind of drops out. And this, I think, would be the equivalent to Trump, I guess, I don't know, heading Glastonbury, festival. I can see him doing it. It would almost be like Trump awarding himself an Oscar, sweeping the board at the Oscars. And people, the common man, like it and they're amused by it. And of course, when Nero dies, although all the kind of New York Times equivalents are ecstatic about it, there are actually lots of people who are befret, and an enormous amount of flowers are actually laid on his grave. And there are people who actually pop up in Greece pretending to be Nero. And this is important. And obviously, there's no capital in pretending to be Nero if there isn't a market for Nero. And in a weird way, that's actually clearly going to happen in America, right? Assuming Trump doesn't go to prison, because it's looking likely that the Supreme Court is working with him, and assuming that he wins the next election, after his next term, his last term, I guarantee you there will be a fight to inherit his mantle, to be the new Donald Trump, to appeal to that sort of popularist, tradition. And we've seen that already with the likes of Matt Gaetz. Matt Gaetz is actually modeling himself to be the new Trump. And when Trump departs the political scene, I guarantee you someone like him is going to step forward. And I guess that would be the difference between Trump and Nixon, is that no one actually wanted to be the new Nixon. Although here's the interesting thing, right? Nixon himself was discredited. I mean, I know he did his interviews with David Frost and he spoke at the Oxford Union, and he really tried to transform himself into a statesman and a sage, but he never quite pulled it off. However, Nixon's politics endured. So Nixon, I think, a lot of American political historians, far more knowledgeable than I am, would say, Nixon's actually the man who really invents and perfects the appeal to the little guy, as opposed to the establishment who are his heirs. I mean, Reagan, to some extent, he's saying he's an ordinary person, and I'm not a stuck-up snob. I didn't come from the establishment. Reagan's whole pitch was that I am an ordinary middle American. I happen to have been in Hollywood, and all the rest of it, but I actually speak for mainstream America. Trump's is a more aggressive form of that appeal, but it's a world away from the Republican appeal in the mid-20th century, in the earlier 20th century. The Republican Party was clearly a much more sort of staid and elitist party, but then it became not that from Nixon onwards. So Nixon at college, he founded a society called the Orthogonians, the square shooters. And they are all about, they're all about saying we are not the privileged people on campus. We are the ordinary people. We are the little guys. We poke fun at our betters. We poke fun at the elite. And in that society that Nixon founded, where he was a student, you can see the kind of contours of Republican Party politics right now that we championed, the small town, the rural village, against the big cities, the highly educated people. And I think that Nixon created that, and that will endure. I also think commentators who, again, probably vastly more knowledgeable about American politics than I am, are saying that Trump has kind of created a new constituency. He has an unexpected degree of support from minority voters, and perhaps that's something that the future Republican candidates will be able to draw on. So I wonder then, what do you think about the way in which he's behaved over the past few months, and presumably will be paving over the next few months that he has leading up to the election? How damaging do you think that will be to the fabric of American democracy? And is it something that the future candidates, I guess the Democrats as well as the Republicans, might draw lessons from? Or will all these court cases be remembered as a kind of embarrassing incident just like Nixon's? So just to keep you up to date, there is the fraud case in New York State, the defamation and sexual assault case in Manhattan, the hush money case also in Manhattan, the Mar-a-Lago documents case, the election subversion case in Georgia, the federal election subversion case. And just to finish on that, in 30 states, cases were filed over whether Trump should actually be thrown out of the 2024 ballot under a theory about the 14th Amendment. I actually think it will probably be the latter, actually. So before this all happened, a lot of people, and myself included, thought that this could be really damaging and toxic for American politics, that it could actually corrode the pluralism and the democracy it depends on, which is basically, if you lose, you walk away and your opponents don't then kill you, metaphorically, or put you in jail or something, because they know that when they lose, you won't do the same to them. So therefore, you treat them with respect. And I think a lot of people feared that this would be a complete disaster and that, there would be riots on the streets and the rest of it. But actually, what's happening and what we've seen happen is that Trump has been ridiculed. I mean, the Republican media have largely abandoned him. Fox News, the New York Post, and so on. The Republican Party have not fully come out in support of him yet. Some say that if he's convicted, they won't support a criminal, but then again, they may. I don't think it actually matters, if truth be told. I don't think it matters whether Trump actually wins the election or not. I think America will get what America deserves. However, I think that he might be remembered as a classic sort of tragicomic episode. After his loss, he left office in this ridiculous kind of shambolic, actually slightly pitiful way. And actually, his legacy, if he had sort of even grumpily conceded after losing to Biden, I know it's impossible to imagine him graciously conceding, but if he kind of reluctantly and rather bitterly conceded, then, I think his legacy would be less tarnished than it is right now. And then what if he gets convicted or if he goes to prison? What kind of impact would that have? Well, let's just say right from the start, I don't think he's ever going to go to prison. I mean, Donald Trump, if anything, is an expert on litigation. And I think he and his lawyers will find ways to prolong any trial, and any case. There will be appeal after appeal after appeal. I also don't actually think there's much appetite to send Donald Trump to jail. A lot of Americans just want this soap opera to end. And if he wins the election, you know what? It's just a different chapter. And if he loses, lots of Americans will just want this over for it to end, rather like they did with Nixon. Nixon was pardoned by his successor, Gerald Ford, basically because they thought, yeah, he's clearly guilty of his crimes, but we just want to put an end to this. We want to put it to bed now. You know what? We don't want this hanging over us for another 4 years. And I think that's what people feel about Trump. The thing is, he doesn't make a very persuasive martyr, does he? I mean, that's not really in his skill set, playing the victim. Trump doesn't do that because he hates losers. So I think if he loses, he will probably go and sulk in Mar-a-Lago and tweet for the rest of his days. And he'll have an influence over the future of the Republican Party. Yes, he may be holed up in Mar-a-Lago playing a lot of golf, but the Republican Party will pander to him because the base loves him. Well, I think that is a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining me, folks. Here's to an astoundingly interesting 2024. We have an entire year ahead of us and lots to look forward to. Thanks again, guys. Bye for now.